You are following the rules. You know this because you learned them carefully. Spend less than you earn. Build an emergency fund. Avoid bad debt. Invest early. Diversify. These are not wrong rules. But here is something nobody told you when you learned them. Every rule was written at a specific moment in time, for a specific set of conditions, for a specific version of the problem, and the conditions have changed, not slightly, significantly. The interest rate environment that made one rule correct is gone. The job market that made another rule reliable is different. The inflation dynamic that made a third rule safe is not the same dynamic anymore. But the rules stayed. They got passed down, from book to podcast to advisor to you, without a timestamp, without a context, without a warning that they were designed for a world that no longer looks like this one. You are navigating a new problem with an old map, and the map was never wrong. It just stopped describing the territory. If you want videos that show you not just the rules, but when the rules stopped applying, subscribe now. That is exactly what this channel is built for. Notice something for a moment. This is not only a finance pattern. It happens everywhere rules get passed from one person to the next. Health advice works the same way. A doctor in a different decade gave guidance for a different body, for a different food supply, for a different daily life. The advice traveled forward, the context did not. Career advice works the same way. Someone told you to stay loyal to one company, climb slowly. Wait your turn. That advice came from a labor market that rewarded patience with security. That labor market is not the one you are standing in. Relationship advice works the same way too. Rules about timing, roles, and what a stable partnership looks like existed for a reason. They were shaped by economic and social conditions from another era. The rule survived. The reason for the rule did not survive with it. You inherited instructions without inheriting the situation that made those instructions correct. That is the pattern. Now look closer at money. Money makes it easiest to see. Think about the rule that says, keep 3 to 6 months of expenses saved. That rule was built inside a specific interest rate world. A world where borrowing was harder to access quickly, where job loss meant a longer, slower search, where a bank account earning a modest return was still doing something useful for you. The rule made sense there. Now look at the world you actually live in. Access to credit is faster. Job markets move differently. Inflation quietly eats value sitting in low-yield accounts. The rule did not adjust. It just kept being repeated. Same words. Different territory underneath it. Think about the rule that says avoid debt at almost any cost. That rule came from an era of extremely high interest rates. Borrowing was punishing. Inflation made debt dangerous in a specific way. In a different rate environment, the math around debt changes. Not all debt behaves the same. Not all borrowing carries the same risk. But the rule you inherited does not mention the environment it assumes. It just says avoid debt. Full stop. No context attached. Think about the rule that says get a stable job and stay there. Let time and tenure build your security. That rule assumes a labor market with long tenure and predictable raises. It assumes employer loyalty flowing in both directions. That labor market described a real period of history. It does not fully describe the one many people are standing in now. Roles shift faster. Stability looks different. The old version of loyalty does not always get returned. The rule survived the shift. The conditions did not. Think about the rule that says diversify, hold, and wait it out. That rule came from decades with a certain shape to them, certain growth patterns, certain recovery timelines. The principle behind diversification still has value, but the specific expectations built into that rule came from a specific stretch of history, not from a universal guarantee. Here is what all of these examples share. Every one of them was correct somewhere, at some point, under some set of conditions. None of them arrived to you with that information attached. You just received the instruction. Spend less than you earn. Build a cushion. Avoid debt. Get stable. Diversify. Wait it out. 5 words of instruction, 0 words of context. And without context, you cannot tell if a rule still applies. You cannot tell if it stopped applying years ago, unnoticed. This is the part most people never sit with. A rule is not just an instruction. A rule is a compressed answer to a problem. Someone, somewhere faced a specific situation. They found an approach that worked. That approach got summarized into a short, Portable sentence. The sentence is easy to carry. The situation behind the sentence is not carried with it, so the sentence keeps moving, passed from person to person, generation to generation, feed to feed, but the situation stays behind, frozen in the moment that created it. You end up holding a sentence with no memory of what created it, and you treat that sentence as if it were timeless, as if it were true everywhere, forever, in every condition. That is the quiet error. Not in the rule itself, in the way the rule gets treated. Think about how many rules you follow without ever asking when they were written, not who wrote them, when, because the who rarely matters as much as the when. A rule written in high inflation carries different assumptions than one written in low inflation. A rule written when housing costs less carries different assumptions than a rule written now. A rule written before certain technologies existed carries different assumptions than one written after them. You were never told to check the date on the rule, you were only told to follow it. And following it felt responsible, felt careful, felt like the mark of someone doing things correctly. That feeling is not wrong. It is just aimed at the wrong target. You can follow a rule perfectly and still solve the wrong problem. Perfect execution of an outdated instruction still produces an outdated result. This is the part that is hard to sit with, so sit with it slowly. Doing the right thing, the way you were taught, does not guarantee the right outcome. Not for the world you are actually standing in. The teaching was built for another world. Your effort is real. Your discipline is real. The rule underneath your effort may not be. Pause on that for a second before we continue, because what comes next is not a new list of rules. It is something quieter than that. It is the mechanism itself. The reason rules travel forward while their context stays behind. Once you see that mechanism, you cannot unsee it. Not just in money, in everything you were taught without a timestamp. Before we continue, drop a comment right now. Is there a money rule you followed for years that eventually stopped working, and you only understood why much later? Tell me below. I read every single one. Here is the mechanism, named plainly. Rules travel through time. Contexts do not. A rule is a sentence. It is light. It is easy to carry. It fits in a conversation, a caption, or a piece of family advice. A context is heavy. It is made of interest rates, labor conditions, housing costs, and technology. It includes inflation and dozens of other moving parts that shift constantly. When someone hands you a rule, they are handing you the light part. The heavy part actually determines whether the rule still works. That heavy part gets left behind. You receive half the information and treat it as the whole answer. That is not a personal failure. It is simply how information moves between people. Nobody sits down and hands you the exact conditions behind their advice. They just say, "Here is my advice." The conditions are implied, unspoken, assumed to be permanent. But nothing about economic conditions is permanent. Interest rates move. Labor markets shift. Technology changes what a job even looks like. Inflation rewrites what a dollar can actually do. The rule stays fixed while the floor underneath it keeps moving. This is why a rule can be followed correctly and still fail you. Correct execution of the rule was never the missing piece. The missing piece was whether the rule still matched your moment. And you had no way of knowing that. Nobody hands you rules with an expiration date printed on them. Nobody says this advice was true for roughly this decade, under roughly these conditions, may not apply after that. Advice simply gets repeated, confidently, permanently, as if it were a law of nature, not a response to circumstances. Now here is the cost, not the financial cost. The quieter one. When you follow an outdated rule with discipline, you feel responsible. You feel like someone doing the right thing. That feeling becomes part of your identity. Careful person, disciplined person, person who avoids unnecessary risks. The identity feels earned, and in a sense, it is earned. You really are being careful. You really are being disciplined. But discipline applied to an outdated rule does not guarantee a good outcome. It produces a well-executed version of an outdated approach. The feeling of doing it right and actually doing right are separate things. They usually overlap. That is what makes this so easy to miss. Most of the time, the standard rule and the correct approach match. But when conditions shift and the rule does not shift, those two things separate. You keep doing the responsible-looking thing. The responsible-looking thing quietly stops being the effective thing. The feeling of responsibility never changes, so you have no internal signal telling you something is off. The discomfort you would expect from doing something wrong never arrives because you are not doing something wrong. You are doing something outdated. Those feel completely different from the inside. Wrong feels like tension. Outdated feels like nothing at all. It just feels like normal behavior until the results stop matching the effort. This is why so many people describe a strange gap later in life. They followed every rule they were given. They did everything they were told counted as responsible, and the results did not match the effort they expected. Not because they failed, because the rules they followed were built for a world that had changed. Nobody warned them the map had an expiration date. So what do you do with this? Not a 5-step plan, not a new set of rules to follow with the same blind confidence. Something simpler and slightly less comfortable. Start asking a different question about the advice you already follow. Not, is this rule correct? Instead, when was this rule correct? Under what conditions? And are those conditions still the ones you're standing in? That single shift changes how you relate to financial advice. It does not mean throwing out old rules. Some of them still describe your situation accurately. It means no longer assuming a rule is timeless because it sounds confident. Confidence is not the same thing as current. A rule can be stated with total certainty and still be outdated. The people repeating it are not lying to you. They inherited the rule the same way you did, without a timestamp, without a warning. They pass it forward the same way it was passed to them. That is how outdated instructions survive for decades. Not through deception, through repetition without context. Every generation hands the next one a set of compressed answers. The compression strips away the one detail that matters most. You are not the first person standing on an old map. You are simply the most recent one to notice the terrain has changed. Think about the specific rules sitting in your own head right now. The ones you have never once questioned. The ones that feel like facts instead of advice. Some of them probably still apply. The conditions that created them may still describe where you are. Others were built for a rate environment that no longer exists, a labor market that no longer exists, a version of debt, savings, or investing that behaved differently than it does now. You cannot tell which is which just by how confident the rule sounds. Confidence does not carry a timestamp. Repetition does not carry a timestamp. The fact that your parents followed it does not carry a timestamp either. The only way to know is to ask a quieter question. When was this built? And is that still where you are standing? This is uncomfortable because it removes the shortcut. The shortcut was simple. Find the rule. Follow the rule. Feel responsible. The slower version asks you to look at the conditions underneath the rule. That takes more effort than following a sentence. But it also means you are no longer navigating blind. You are no longer assuming the map was drawn yesterday. It might have been drawn decades ago. In a completely different climate, notice something else while you sit with this. The rules that get repeated the most are often the oldest ones, not because they are the most accurate, because they are the easiest to compress into a single sentence. The rules that require context to explain properly get repeated less. They do not fit neatly into a caption or a piece of casual advice. So the rules that survive are not necessarily the rules that are true. They are the rules that were easiest to compress into something portable. That is a strange thing to realize about advice you have trusted for years. It was not selected for accuracy in your specific moment. It was selected for portability across time. And portability is not the same thing as correctness. Sit with that difference for a moment before moving forward with anything. The rules you follow were never wrong. They were written for a world that made them correct. That world changed. The rules did not come with an update, and nobody told you to check if the map still matches your territory. If this changed the way you think about the rules you have been following, subscribe now. Every week, this channel shows you not just the rules, but the conditions that made them true and the moment those conditions quietly changed.